Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Hey strangers, Vince here. I just want to let you know that we are now on Patreon. Because this podcast began as a college course, its purpose is to be educational, and I strongly believe education should not be commercialized. That's why you won't find advertisements here. But like most educators, I am overworked and underpaid, which sometimes gets in the way of making the podcast. And that's why I've turned to Patreon. As a patron of the podcast, you'll get access to new episodes 1 week before everyone else, along with bonus episodes exclusively for patrons, which will include movie commentaries, interviews, and discussions of special topics requested by patrons such as yourself. And of course, you'll also get shout-outs in future episodes and the personal satisfaction that comes with supporting education and the people who make content you enjoy. So go to patreon.com/Stranger Things in the 1980s. Now, on with the episode. Welcome back to Stranger Things in the 1980s. This time around, it's just me here in the studio. So, yes, I know, I'm as disappointed as you are. Hopefully, this episode won't be too disappointing. This time around, we're talking about Chapter 6 of Season 2, The Spy. And I expect that this episode is going to be quite a bit shorter than the other ones. So let's go ahead and get started and dive in. Last time around, I talked about how Will is the spy Eleven was supposed to be. And we really see that happening here. And in fact, that is the meaning behind the title of this episode. One of the cool things about the show, amongst many cool things, is that each episode title typically has multiple levels of meaning. In this case, the spy is referencing Will. In the previous episode, he and Mike talked about being a spy to spy on the shadow entity, the shadow monster. But in this episode, it flips the script a little bit and shows that actually, yes, Will is the spy, but he is spying for the shadow monster. So again, Will is the spy Eleven was supposed to be. There's a few other points about this episode that I think are really interesting. So one question is, why doesn't Will recognize Hopper, Bob, or Dr. Owens? And I think the easiest suggestion is that he's losing his memory. We do see in the episode the CT scans of his brain activity. As the shadow monster becomes more active, Will's personality and sense of self disappears more. And so, again, I think the interpretation, or the easy interpretation, is that Will, in losing himself, is losing his memories, which is why he doesn't recognize Hopper, Bob, or these other characters. I think, however, there is another interpretation, or another explanation. And that is the people that he doesn't recognize are the people who he did not know before the previous year. He didn't know Hopper, he didn't know Bob, he didn't know Dr. Owens until after he was rescued from the Upside Down and experienced his ordeal there. And we know that it is during his experience in the Upside Down that he becomes sort of infected by the virus of the shadow monster. And that's where, or excuse me, that's when the shadow monster's influence starts to take hold. And so it makes sense that Will won't recognize those people because he wasn't himself and hasn't been himself for the past year in the story. He doesn't recognize these people because the shadow monster doesn't recognize these. Another aspect of the story that I think is really interesting, the tunnel system that plays an important part of this episode, representing, of course, the shadow monster's incursion into our world, is a literal representation of the Upside Down. I mean, yeah, there is that sense of terraforming which is happening in those tunnels, that the Upside Down atmosphere is taking over in that space. But of course, the tunnels are underground, which are, to some extent, literally upside down. If our world exists on the surface and the upside down is the level that exists below our reality, then that is represented literally in the story through these tunnels throughout Hawkins. And the other thing I really like about this episode is the relationship between Dustin and Steve. We saw this a little bit in the previous episode, but now we really see the relationship between the two of them, which is completely unexpected. As I've mentioned several times before, Steve was one of my least favorite characters in the previous season, whereas Dustin has always been one of my favorite characters. Dustin and Hopper are the two favorites for me. You wouldn't think that these two characters would mesh the way they do, and yet they really do. And in fact, Steve becomes a mentor figure for Dustin, and I love how that relationship between the two of them plays out, not just in this season, but in future seasons as well. So those are the big ideas that this episode explores. In terms of some recurring themes and motifs, we get several of those coming back. So numerology, again. We've talked about numerology before and how the number 11 is represented in various ways throughout the previous episodes. We get that referenced here, and that when Will is being examined by the doctors, his heart rate is 220 and his temperature is 106. Those numbers are very prominently stated in this particular episode. And of course, if you add those numbers together, 220, 106, they all equal 11. Trust is referenced again. Dr. Owen says to Joyce, "I need you to," and then Joyce cuts him off and says, "Stay calm, trust you." And then later Murray says to Jonathan, "Trust issues, am I right?" And that phrase gets repeated a few times in there. So trust, again, that issue of trust, which has become such a prominent overarching theme within the show, is again represented here. It's being deliberately stated again. Another theme which is repeated or recurs here is the theme of cancer. There is the line, "It's been growing beneath us like a cancer." And as we saw in the previous season, that season, the sort of overarching metaphor was cancer. And we see that represented or stated here again, along with the line, "Our best guess right now is that it's some kind of virus." Whereas this particular season's one of the overarching metaphors is PTSD. We also, as we talked about in a previous episode when we looked at AIDS and the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, I think this concept is represented in the story through the infection of the shadow monster and the way the shadow monster has infected not just Will, but the other creatures, the Demodogs as well. And it is compared to a virus, an unknown virus that is something new and something which they don't know how to combat, which is exactly how AIDS was regarded in the 1980s. And then there is a sort of visual metaphor or visual theme or motif which is repeated here, and that's the idea of chumming the water. If we go back to the first season, we got several references or several suggestions that the Demogorgon was like a shark. It's attracted to blood. And how do Steve and Dustin try to lure Dart to them? It's by spreading chunks of meat on a pathway to the junkyard. So they are metaphorically chumming the water the way that you would attract a shark. So those are the recurring themes and motifs that I saw in this particular episode. As for illusions, there were two, I think, really dominant visual illusions, which are to aliens and, again, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Now, we've talked about aliens to quite a large extent already, but this is where we start to get some really strong aliens vibes in this episode. And the next episode, or not the next episode, but the episode after the next one, where the Demodogs attack the lab, we get some major aliens vibes. But we do get that represented here in several ways. There's the line, "Stay frosty, boys." Of course, the Demodogs themselves are xenomorph-like, and we've talked about that many times before, how the design of the Demogorgon is very influenced by the xenomorph from the Aliens franchise. And then when the soldiers go into the tunnels to explore them to find where Will sends them, and they're attacked by the Demodogs, we have several visual references to the movie of Aliens when the Space Marines in that movie go into the power plant and encounter the aliens for the first time. So we got motion trackers, we've got video monitors, we've got the audio messages over the radio. It's very deliberately calling back to aliens or suggestive of aliens. So yeah, major aliens vibes here. Temple of Doom as well. Now, we've talked about the visual references to the Temple of Doom in previous episodes, how Hopper, his silhouette when he's digging and wearing his hat and grabbing his hat when he's in the tunnels and the torches and all of that stuff, has some strong Temple of Doom imagery. Specifically Temple of Doom, not just Indiana Jones, that franchise, but specifically Temple of Doom, because Temple of Doom was released in 1984, the same year in which this season is set. And we get that again in this particular episode and what is going on between Jonathan and Nancy when they spend the night at Murray's place. And we get the quick cross-cutting editing between the two of them in their separate rooms talking to themselves. And that's something which is straight out of Temple of Doom. If you haven't seen Temple of Doom, it's one of the weaker entries in the Indiana Jones franchise, but it is still pretty good. And I'm sure at some point we'll do a commentary on it in the future. So go ahead, if you haven't seen Temple of Doom, give that a watch. Other allusions to He-Man and Barbie, as Erica is playing with Lucas's toys. She's making them kiss and says they're in love. And, Lucas points out they're from completely different universes, which is, I think, interesting if you want to look at it metaphorically, because you could say the same of Lucas and Max and their budding romantic relationship. Yeah, they're from two different universes. But yeah, He-Man, we've seen Masters of the Universe figures before in the last season that Lucas has a Man-at-Arms figure, which made sense because he was kind of the armorer of our little group here in Hawkins, just as Man-at-Arms was the armorer in the universe of He-Man. We see an album cover for Space Knife. This is in Murray's home. As we talked about in the previous episode, Space Knife, we saw the arcade machine for the Quest for the Space Knife, which wasn't a real game. Rather, Space Knife is the name of a band that one of the set designers and set decorators, that's the name of his band. And so we see a Space Knife album as a shout out to that. We see a sign in Murray's house that says Miller Time. So an advertisement for Miller beer. And I think it's interesting that
when we see signs or labels for alcohol, we see them in Murray's place. We saw he had a sign for Tuborg Gold. He's the one who drinks the Sladeknaya vodka, as we talked about. And in this case, he has a sign for Miller beer. And it's Miller time used to be their slogan. We see a movie poster in Max's bedroom for Endless Summer, which is, if I recall correctly, a documentary about surfing and surfer culture in California. We get some visual references to The Body, the Stephen King novella The Body, which was made into the film Stand By Me. And we get that. We got a little bit of that in the previous season, but a little bit more obvious or prominent in this particular episode. When Dustin and Steve are walking along the railroad tracks, it is framed and filmed very much like what happens in that particular movie. So in that movie, or that novel, the novella, excuse me, point of the story is these young boys, sort of on the cusp of adolescence. They go on a journey to find a dead body, and they travel along railroad tracks to find the body. And so it represents not so much a hero's journey, but a rite of passage for them, because seeing the dead body becomes their maturation into, or their realization of their own mortality. So it's a coming of age story, and we get that a little bit in this particular episode, specifically with Dustin. He's experiencing some growing pains there. References to Farrah Fawcett. So for those of you who are young and who don't know, Farrah Fawcett was a television star. She was one of the Charlie's Angels from that TV show, who was regarded as a sex symbol of the time, specifically the 1970s and early 1980s. So we learned that Steve uses the Farrah Fawcett hairspray and suggests that Dustin use that too. When Dustin and Steve set up their trap and the junkyard, visually, I thought that was very reminiscent of the Mad Max franchise, specifically the Road Warrior, the way everything is sort of a post-industrial, post-apocalyptic kind of landscape. And they fortify the bus the way that in the Road Warrior, vehicles, cars, trucks, and a gas tanker in that particular movie are fortified. And then finally, the Demodogs. Of course, the Demodogs contributes to the Aliens vibe, because again, as we've talked about, the design of the Demogorgon and the Demodogs was inspired by the xenomorphs from Aliens, but they're also, in their Demodog form, is very reminiscent of the demon dogs in Ghostbusters. And as we've seen, Ghostbusters is one of the really sort of foundational texts for this particular season. And I had forgot to mention that in our Ghostbusters episode, but yeah, when you look at the Demodogs, and this is the first time we really get a good view of them in this episode, the Demodogs are visually very reminiscent of the demon dogs of Ghostbusters. And then finally, the music of this episode. We get a few prominent needle drops or featured songs. We get Hammer to Fall by Queen, which incidentally is one of my favorite Queen songs, probably my absolute favorite Queen song. Hammer to Fall, which is all about coming to terms with your own sense of mortality, particularly during the Cold War, which is very much in keeping with the time period of the show. We get another Billie Holiday song, You Better Go Now, and of course this is in Murray's house. He seems to be a big Billie Holiday fan. But, that song deals with, not really about the dangers of love, but it's about two people who aren't necessarily good for each other, but have a strong attraction. And it's kind of suggested that is similar to Jonathan and Nancy in this episode. We get Blue Bayou, the Roy Orbison classic. It's a song about longing and wanting to return to one's home and a sense of peace and contentment or innocence. And we can kind of relate that to especially Will. I mean, that is what Will wants, but also the entire Byers family just want to return to a simpler time. And then we get the Rat classic, Round and Round. So that plays when Billy is lifting weights when Lucas goes to find Max. Classic song. It's a song that I really dig. And that's really a song about games that people play with each other in terms of like psychological games or romantic games, and the idea that people play hard to get, but the coming together of those people is sort of foretold or is a foregone conclusion. You know, you go round and round playing these games, but, you know, I knew what was going to happen in the end. So that's it for this particular episode. It's a pretty suspenseful episode, I think, and a very dramatic one, especially with what is happening with Will and the shadow monster. Okay, so next time your homework is to look into the history of Latchkey Kids, and we're going to talk about the episode The Lost Sister. So make sure that you go and watch that. So until then, as always, take it easy, take care, and stay strange.
Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxam, used under license from Filmstro. You can support this podcast, ask questions, or give topic suggestions by going to patreon.com/Stranger Things in the 1980s.